this is indeed the title of my talk, Interpreting Aristotle. And also, let me start with Scotus very, very briefly. Scotus, one places, well-known places where medieval discussed the nature of matter is the commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences. Book 2, distinction 12, is the classical locus classicus where when one can find an elaboration about the nature of matter, because such a distinction is devoted to the creation of matter by God. So, and this is a problem, because on the one hand, it's clear that there are good theological reasons for supporting the existence of matter, because it's clear that since God created the world, God must have the idea of matter. This is a clear point that distinguishes, for instance, Neoplatonic philosophy from Christian theology, because for a medieval theologian, is assumed that God has the idea of matter. So, in a way, from a theological point of view, it seems to be there is an agreement on such a claim. But philosophically speaking, someone can have some problems in reconciling Aristotle with this theological assumption, because for Aristotle and for Averroes, the nature of matter is that of being a potential being. So potential being is the true nature of matter. Matter is something that exists in potency to forms. So in itself has not a degree of actuality or not a degree of formality. And in a way, to my mind, also this assumption, namely that the nature of matter consists in its potential being, is a point of agreement between philosophers. When Scotus elaborates on matter in Lectura, Book 2, Distinction 12, for example, Scotus condenses his position in three theses. It is not important. Today, we have no time to dwell into the arguments of Scotus for defending these three theses. What is important is that for Scotus, first, thesis T1, matter exists. There is not a problem with that. This is quite curious in a way, because we are now today accustomed to deal with reductionist theories, for instance, in philosophy of mind, where the spiritual aspect or the formal aspect is reduced to a material aspect. But in metaphysical discussion, there is also in the Middle Ages a different reductionist interpretation where matter is reduced to form, and the being of matter may be reduced to the being of form. And this is quite natural, because if matter is something in potency to form, form is the actuality of matter, so the actuality of this potentiality. And so the being of form is the true being of matter. And Scotus spends some time to prove that matter exists as an independent principle, something apart from form. The second thesis is that matter has its own kind of actual being, which is the one that is expressed by the conditions we have of it. This is an important statement by Scotus, according to which matter has a certain degree of being. I write here actual being, but is under discussion whether the degree of being or the kind of being of matter is an actual being or only a potential being. But it's clear for Scotus that matter has its own kind of being. And what is interesting is that Scotus, by such a strange expression, the conditions we have of it, want to emphasize that we cannot grasp in what is the positive nature of matter. We have not any direct cognitive access to matter in order to say what matter is. We can obtain information about matter only indirectly by attributing to matter some physical or metaphysical function. For instance, matter is, we call matter, we are accustomed to call matter what is the ultimate substratum of predication, for example, or what is the substratum of change, or some other principle of this sort. So, and are this information about the physical and metaphysical role performed or played by matter that I can infer information about the kind of being that matter has. And the third thesis is that matter is really distinct from form. Is a sort of, this is simply a consequence of thesis one, in which I can make distinct matter and form by saying, for example, this is matter, this is form, and matter is not form. So I can have a linguistic device in order to set apart matter from form and form from matter. So the crucial point that it is in discussion is that encompassed in thesis 2, what is the kind of being of matter? Because in a way, one can agree with Scotus that matter exists, is distinct from form, and has a certain being. Okay, let me move now to the Aristotelian text. So sorry, I limit here to speak of this text because I studied for a long time this chapter of the metaphysics, and this book of metaphysics. We are in book 7, as you know, is the book where Aristotle begins his analysis of substance. And it is precisely in this chapter that Aristotle begins to speak of substance. Aristotle distinguishes 4 senses of substance here. Substance has essence, substance has genus, substance has universal, and substance has substratum. And the investigation is on the last meaning, substance has substratum. I can reconstruct the argument of Aristotle in this way, but it's just one possible reconstruction because the Greek text presents some philological variants, so can change the meaning of the chapter. But very generally speaking, Aristotle starts with a definition of the substratum like that of which everything else is predicated and itself is not predicating of anything else. And after says that the substratum can be divided into 3 items, matter, form, and the compound of matter, form. So if one apply the, let me call it the predicative criterion for identifying substance or identifying the substratum. What is exactly the prime substratum or the primary substance, matter, form, or the compound of matter and form? Aristotle realizes, and you can find it in the first stage in this slide, in the definition of the substance, that defining substance in just a predicative terms, substance like that which is not predicated of a substratum, but of which all else is predicated. This is, Aristotle says, is not enough. and this statement itself is obscure, and further on this view, matter becomes substance. Some contemporary commentators raised the question of the consistency of Aristotle's analysis of substance in the metaphysics with Aristotle's analysis of substance in the categories. But we can leave aside this problem. But it's clear that Aristotle see the predicative criterion non-sufficient criterion for finding the primary substance, because it leads to find the matter has the primary substance. This Aristotle says that this is not enough. Here in the stage number 1, I omitted where there is 3 points, an argument Aristotle gives for proving this point. The argument is that is called in literature the stripping away arguments. According to Aristotle, we can remove from things all the accidental properties and all the essential properties, and what remains is matter. So if any accidental predicate and any essential predicate is predicate of matter, matter turn out to be the primary substance, and is exactly the first conclusion C1 of the chapter. To those who consider the question, does matter alone must seem to be substance? But Aristotle clearly doesn't want to reach this conclusion, which sounds like a Platonic conclusion, maybe. Although even the Platonists would object to this conclusion, because even for that, matter is not the primary substance. But Aristotle, instead, in the step number 2, introduced what seems to be a definition of matter, or a criterion for identifying what matter is. Aristotle says that by matter I mean that which in itself is neither a particular thing, nor of a certain quantity, nor assigned to any other of the categories by which being is determined. For there is something of which each of these is predicated, whose being is different from that of each of the predicates. Aristotle characterized matter as something which poses outside the categories. Matter is not substance, nor quantity, nor quality, and so on. So it's something absolutely indeterminate, but of which all predicates are predicated. Aristotle says this in the parenthetical clause. You can see in the is just the last sentence in bold in step number 2, where Aristotle says that the predicates other than substance are predicated of substance, while substance is predicated of matter. So all the accidental predicates are predicate of substance, and substance itself is predicate of matter. The conclusion is that, again, if we adopt this point of view, it follows that matter is substance. Well, at this point, Aristotle offers his solution. Step number 3. Aristotle says that this is impossible, for the true criteria for finding substance are separability and thisness. Namely, substance is what is separable in itself, can exist separately from other things, and it is thisness, namely this something, to the T in Greek, so this something completely determinate. And these two new criteria, separability and thisness, is not clear that whether these two criteria in a way replace the first one, the predicative criterion, or simply integrate the first criterion. By the way, separability and thisness, Aristotle says, are thought to belong chiefly to substance, and so form and the compound of form and matter would be thought to be substance rather than matter. Well, what is important for our investigation into Aquinas and Scotus? What is important of this text? 2 points you must keep in mind. First, this term here that in Greek is heteron, which is translated by in Latin as diversum and or alterum. Namely, the idea that the being of matter is different from the being of the other predicates, including substance. So this is a clear statement of Aristotle concerning matter, that matter has its own kind of being. For otherwise, it would be impossible to predicate any other predicates of matter. And the second problematic or important claim point is the following. The parenthetical clause I have highlighted in red, the 2 points. The parenthetical clause where Aristotle says that substance is predicated of matter, which can be understood in a Platonic perspective, but is very strange or difficult to understand from an Aristotelian perspective in a way. Okay. From this point, we can move to the Middle Ages, and so I hope that my reconstruction of the chapter is more or less clear. There is an argumentation by Aristotle according to which what is clear that matter cannot be the primary substance. So cannot be substance or only matter the substance. And for Aristotle, the form and the compound of matter form according to the 2 new criteria, separability and thisness, are more substance and more being than matter. The problem concerns the step number 2. The step number 2, where Aristotle says in Greek lego ten eulen, so by matter I mean that which, and so on. The problem is here whether Aristotle is introducing his own account of matter or Aristotle is reporting a different position, which is probably the position of the Platonist. Well, Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, in his commentary on the Metaphysics, book 7, Lectio 2, has no doubt about that. When Aristotle says, I'm reading this slide, when Aristotle says, I say, however, dico autem, since the preceding argument showing that only matter is substance seemed to proceed from ignorance of matter is, Aristotle therefore subsequently explains what matter is according to truth, so according to his position, as declared in the first book of the Physics. Hence, I highlighted in red the crucial claim by Thomas. Hence, the philosopher also takes here the concept of matter as it has been investigated in the physical sciences. So, no problem for Aristotle that that Aristotle is introducing his own view of matter. I say, however, that matter is that which, according to itself, that is considered according to its essence is in no way a what, that is neither a substance, nor a quality, nor any of the other genera by which being is divided or determined. Well, what is about what the interpretation of Thomas about the 2 points highlighted in red in Aristotle text? Why Aristotle should introduce his position of matter and conclude that substance is predicate of matter, especially because the second conclusion of the chapter is a reformulation of the first conclusion. According to those people who consider things in this way, matter is substance. Only matter is substance, or matter is the primary substance. Thomas offer the following proposal of interpretation. First, when Aristotle says that the being of matter is different, heteron, from the being of the other things, this is not a problem for Aquinas, because it's true that matter has a being which is different from the being of form. For Aquinas, this is the proof that for Aristotle, since matter is outside the categories, is not substance, nor quantity, nor quality, that the being of matter lies simply in his being in potency, in his potential being. This is his interpretation of this text of Aristotle. Aristotle is introducing his own view of matter as a potential being. But it's clear that when I read Aristotle in this way, he has or she has the problem of make sense of the parenthetical clause where Aristotle says that substance is predicated of matter. How is it possible, for example, that a substantial predicate has a human being or man can be predicate of something which is only in potency? And Aquinas here observe that the parenthetical claim is introduces a denominative case of predication. But the matter in the parenthetical claim is understood in a very unusual way by Aquinas. Has not as matter, but as matter thing, material thing. The Latin term, which is like almost an apex in Aquinas, there is two other currencies in the metaphysics commentary, is materiatum, hoc materiatum. When I am predicating man of matter, I am predicating indeed man of this material thing, hoc materiatum est homo, namely is the particular thing, Socrates, for example, or this particular man considered according to its matter. This matter thing or material thing is man. So the predication of the substance of a subject is a sort of identity predication indeed. Is a kind of denominative predication, but that resolves into a predication of identity. This material thing is a man by indicating what is a man. There is not a bearer, a substratum of which human being or man is predicated. And this is clearly a problem for the interpretation of the text, because it does not seem that Aristotle is meaning exactly that. Okay, when Scotus uh, reflect on matter in the Lectura, Book 2, Distinction 12, he considered the argument from Metaphysics Zeta 3. Textually speaking, this is an important point because in the tradition of the commentaries on the sentences, the first argument against the attribution of matter of a certain kind of being is just the argument drawn from metaphysics, extracted from Metaphysics Zeta 3. And to this argument, to the first principal argument, which is precisely the argument of Zeta 3, as understood by Aquinas, when it is said, according to the philosopher, Scotus explains that matter is neither a what, nor a quality, nor a quantity, nor any of those things by which being is determined. I say that this is not state according to the philosopher's intention, and this is the principal exegetical point of Scotus. There, Aristotle is not introducing his position of on matter, but by claim, I call matter, I say that matter is meaning I am assuming matter as understood by the opponents. Scotus said that this claim is stated while opposing for the false position, which seem evident from three things for Scotus. There are three evidence of that Aristotle is proceeding in this way. First, from the subsequent epilogue, thus intending, sed intendentibus, it is the second conclusion of the chapter. Thus intending, matter is the only matter, or matter alone is substance. Second, from the counter-argument, since Aristotle immediately argues to the opposite, but it is impossible, this conclusion that matter is substance. So it's clear that is not Aristotle's position to which Aristotle is opposing in a way. And the third, this is an interesting methodological observation by Scotus, that Aristotle does not customarily formulate the determination of the question among arguments for and against without some mark of the solution. So it's very strange that Aristotle introduces his position within the argument, in the center of the argument, without explaining that he is there resolving the question. In a different text, in the Reportatio 2a, and here I want to thank Gareth Smith for having sent me the text of the forthcoming edition of this text by Scotus. Scotus is much more explicit about his criticism of Aquinas. In the Lectura, there is no mention of Aquinas, direct mention of Aquinas, but Aquinas is explicitly mentioned here. Here, Scotus refers to some who have another imagination of matter. That is something different from form because it can be the terminus of creation. And yet they, namely Aquinas, say it is a contradiction to say that it exists without form. Because the principal problem for Aquinas is that the form is the act of matter. So to say that matter exists without form means that matter exists without act. So it's impossible to say that matter is existing act and existing act without form. it is a contradiction, because it would follow that matter is both actual and not actual, in act and not in act, and cannot be said. And this seems evident through Metaphysics 7. Scotus refers to the argument from Metaphysics. And Scotus is close to Aquinas here, and reminds the reader that the expositor, namely Thomas Aquinas, the expositor of metaphysics, since the argument previously presented proceeded from ignorance of matter, which is exactly the label used by Thomas Aquinas for introducing his interpretation, to show that it is in the highest sense substance. Therefore, in the text here state, Aristotle clarifies what matter is. But Scotus thinks that Aquinas is a very bad interpreter or commentator of Aristotle. I say, however, that the expositor is mistaken there, as in many other places, because neither does this follow from the sequence of the text, the litter of the text, nor is it true in itself. For it's clear that Aristotle argues there against the false opinion of the ancients, who assert that matter is something actual, something that exists in act. What about the term heteron, different, that is the term that, I remind you, led Aquinas to the interpretation of matter, the being of matter as potential being. Matter is outside the categories, therefore matter is something that exists only in a potentiality. Scotus makes two criticism of Aquinas, two arguments, gives here two arguments. The first is that when the philosopher says is different from any being of the other categories, it's clear that it does not say this has his intention. Why not? Because, for example, in Metaphysics Book 8, matter is said to belong to the category of substance by reduction, at least by reduction. This first argument is very ingenuous with respect to Aquinas, because Aquinas himself realizes that matter belongs to the category of substance by reduction. But Aquinas' point is exactly that matter as such, matter in itself, cannot exist in the category of substance, because matter belongs to the category of substance just as a principle of substantiality of the compound. Well, the second argument is a clever argument, indeed, because Scotus observed that this interpretation contradicts the intentions of disposition, because if being is different, then matter is not nothing, since the same and the distinct are differences of being. Therefore, if matter did not have a being distinct from that of form, it could not be called different. So it's ingenious here, Scott, because if Aristotle says that the being of matter is different from the being of form, this means that matter must have its own kind of being. So the problem is, what kind of being matter can have here? Well, for Scotus, is not enough, is not sufficient to say that matter here has a potential being alone. But at the same time, it's clear that, as Scotus says just in the first paragraph, in the first of this slide, matter is not something actual, which is something in act, which is the position of the ancients, maybe the Platonists. So Scotus, at the end of the day, does not clarify his position. Probably the matter as a third kind of being. The bipartition between actual and potential is not sufficient to capture the nature of matter. After Scotus, many philosophers and theologians attribute to matter what they call the entitative being. So a sort of being which is not a fully actual being and is not only a potential being. And Scotus seems to say that this is enough for understanding Aristotle there, namely to say that matter as a sort of being, distinct from form, nothing more, nothing less. Well, 20 years ago, in their commentary on Aristotle Metaphysics Zeta, two contemporary commentators, Michael Frede and Gunther Patzig, rejected an interpretation like that of Scotus. They say that one might also think that Aristotle is not talking about his own conception of matter there, but that the expression lego, I define or I call matter, should be interpreted as by matter I mean here. But previously, he may have referred to a Platonic theory. He could be suggesting there that according to such a Platonic theory, matter, in the Platonic sense, would be considered ousia, substance, a consequence that the Platonists themselves would find extremely unwelcome. However, this interpretation, according to them, is contradicted by the fact that Aristotle, in the following, intends to draw conclusions about the status of matter in his own sense. This conclusion would be unjustified if the argument were based on a Platonic conception of matter. Yes, I understand Fred and passing observation, but to my mind, the reading of Scotus has good textual support. Indeed, the second conclusion of the chapter, let me return to Aristotle text, conclusion C2, if we adopt this point of view, then it follows that matter is substance. What is this point of view? Is the point of view of those ancient philosophers that think that matter has some degree of being, for Scotus of actual being. And this is clear that the opposition in step number 3 of the text works only if the second conclusion is an opposition to the definition of matter given in the previous lines. What is the main problem with Scotus' interpretation? Is that it's very difficult to say that Aristotle wants to speak of a third kind of being in between actual being and potential being. It's clear that there, when in the parenthetic clause, Aristotle speaks of the predication of substance of matter, and attributes a different being to matter, he is thinking in some way of some form of actual being of matter, that matter can exist in act in some way without form. And this is a difficult point, because if one accepts to attribute to matter an actual being, one finds herself in the strange position of holding that for Aristotle, both the ancient philosophers and Aristotle himself have the same position on matter, namely that matter is something actual. So it seems to be good, the interpretation of Thomas Aquinas of escaping that this impasse by attributing to matter only a potential being. Well, just to conclude very briefly, Gregory of Rimini doesn't offer a solution to this problem. It's clear, but try to clarify that what is the issue at stake. Gregory, like Scotus, reminds the position of Aquinas, which is the interpretation of Book 7, Chapter 3 of the Metaphysics. There is the opinion of a certain doctor, namely Thomas Aquinas, the two words in red in this slide, whose reasoning is that if matter were without form, matter would be in act without act, which implies a contradiction. The consequence is clear because that which is act is form, and so the contradiction ensues. Well, according to Gregory of Rimini, these arguments, the arguments of Aquinas, hold a little weight. Regarding the first, the Aquinas interpretation of metaphysics Zeta 3, it must be said that if matter is understood to be in act in the first way mentioned above, namely, here Gregory is referring to his distinction of two meanings of being in act. Being in act in the first sense is being distinct in act. And being in act in the second sense in being separate in act. So, if matter is understood to be in act in the first way mentioned above, namely being distinct in act from form, and if by act form is understood, the consequence is neither impossible nor does it imply any contradiction. And it's just the position, the blunder position taken by Scotus in a way, namely is the first of the three theses of Scotus, namely that matter exists, that matter as a being distinct from form, is a way of saying that matter is not form and form is not matter. So this is no problem with that. But Aquinas could easily accept this solution to the question, because for Aquinas as well, matter and form are two different entities, so in a way there is a being. But what kind of being? Potential being for Aquinas, maybe actual being for Scotus, because the entitative being is a very obscure kind of being, the third kind of being. However, Gregory concludes, if matter is understood to be in act in the second way, the consequence does not hold, because it would not be in act in that way. So it's not possible to imagine that matter exists separately from form. And this is impossibility also, even in the case of God. God has the idea of matter, but God cannot create matter to exist without form, in separation from form. So is a weak kind of being that matter has. I speak at the beginning of reconciliation of Aquinas with Scotus. It's clear that the specification introduced by Gregory aims to make reconciling Scotus' interpretation of chapter 3 of metaphysics with the idea that it is the crucial point in Aquinas' interpretation that matter cannot exist in itself. Because Aquinas attributes to the ancient philosophers, to the Platonists, the idea that matter is something that exists in itself with an actual being separately from form. And it is against such an interpretation that, according to Aquinas, Aristotle argues. So let me return for the last time to the text of Aristotle. And I highlighted again the two main points of the step 2 in red. The claim that the being of matter is different from the being of form and the other predicates, and the idea that substance is predicate of matter. So, to my mind, neither Thomas nor Scotus are able to provide a close interpretation of this chapter. Maybe they didn't discuss the possibility that this chapter is just a aporetic chapter or a dialectic chapter in a way. By the way, the point of force of Aquinas' interpretation in my mind is that Aquinas, by attributing step 2 to the introduction of the real position of Aristotle, he connects very closely the second conclusion of the chapter to the first one. And Aquinas gives consistency to the line of reasoning of Aristotle. But the cost, the textual cost of this interpretation is that the matter highlighted in red, just the last word in the parenthetical clause, should be understood as matter thing, as the compound of matter form considered according to matter, which is not clearly what Aristotle is here saying. Scotus seems to have much evidence, much support, textual support for his position, because it's clear that conclusion C2 is a reaction to the definition of matter in step 2. And so this is in a way allows Scotus to conclude that matter cannot be considered something actual, but no problem with if one considers matter as a thing which has a being distinct from form. So, final word about thank you for your attention. Let me say that this chapter of the metaphysics is a very complicated chapter for contemporary interpreters too, but also for medievals. And it is often, I want to call your attention to the fact that the first argument, the principal argument in many of sentences commentary in the 13th and 14th century starts with discussing exactly the Aristotelian argument of that chapter. Thank you.